whales, his wealth and fame. Great big ears and a big long name. But our Marc Emery takes the spot. The whole world knows he's the Prince of Pot. He's the Prince of Pot.
Remembrance Day ought to be the most important day of the year, commemorating as it does the death and slaughter of young men, women, and civilians because of government lies, deception, politics, and conquest. War is about the tragic loss of human beings on an appalling and colossal scale. Only government power and munitions makers benefit by war. We, the people, as always, suffer at the hands of our government and our so-called enemies. And bear in mind, this Conservative government of Canada plans to spend $450 billion on our Canadian military over the next 20 years. I viewed Romeo Dallaire, a Canadian general commanding the small United Nations peacekeeping force in 1994, when nearly 1 million Tutsi people were slaughtered in just 90 days in Rwanda. Well, he was speaking on CBC's Fifth Estate the other night. Dallaire wrote a book on the horrific carnage he witnessed on that mission called Shake Hands with the Devil. Dallaire spoke at Idea City in Toronto in 2002, as I did on that same day, and we talked admiringly about each other's work in a private conversation later that day. But on this Fifth Estate program, General Dallaire, now a Liberal senator in the government, was commenting on the terrible psychological scars that war and its brutality brings to the soldier. He remarked that 58,000 U.S. soldiers died in the Vietnam War from 1962 to 1973, but 102,000 Vietnam veterans have committed suicide from 1973 to 2007. The real toll of war, he said, is much greater than we are led to believe. Indeed, Dallaire said of the 7,000 Canadian soldiers who have served in Afghanistan since 2002, 133 have died, but perhaps as many as 50 have committed suicide since 2002, and over 2,000 are suffering post-traumatic stress and live damaged, wounded lives. It's worth remembering that 2 million Vietnamese people died in that war of U.S. occupation, and since 2002, 250,000 Afghanis have died from the consequences of the NATO American-Canadian invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, a war nonetheless closer to being lost to the Taliban than at any other time since 2002. And the Taliban had nothing to do with the attacks on September 11, 2001. That was done by radical Saudi Arabian and Egyptian citizens living in the United States. Osama bin Laden is hiding, if he is alive at all, in Pakistan, and Pakistan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia are still considered allies of the United States. One of my cellmates here at North Fraser pretrial was a Canadian soldier of the 1st Canadian Regiment out of my hometown of London, Ontario. And for 10 years he served in the military and had one tour in Afghanistan. Along with teaching me hand-to-hand combat and defensive skills, in case I'm attacked in prison, he said, he received many of the training drills. He recited many of the training drills and chants practice he did hundreds of times in Afghanistan. And one of them was, "We kill with this gun because killing is fun. When our enemy is before us, then killing must be done. Our job is to blow them away." And I said, "You can't be serious." He said, No, that I chanted hundreds and hundreds of times during my training both in Canada and Afghanistan. The fake poppy Canadians ritually wear in the days leading up to the November 11th commemorates the incredible pain-relieving properties of the opium plant. The poppy being the head of the plant that grows beautifully all over much of British Columbia, and that produces the latex gum that is made into opium, morphine, and heroin. Morphine was used first in World War I on over 20 million of the 30 million wounded soldiers of that 4-year war, the most destructive and brutal war in the history of mankind's many wars. Morphine was used to take away the horrible pain of severed limbs, shrapnel-torn bodies, bullet-ravaged limbs, crushed hands, feet, bones, and other hell-born consequences of battle that only a battle-experienced soldier can possibly understand. My father, Alfred Emery, was in the Royal Navy from 1940 to 1945, almost the entire length of World War II. Dad read extensively about war and over 200 books on the subject that were in our family library shelves in the 1960s and 70s. And beginning at the age of 11, I began to read them all too. Almost all were paperbacks by Ballantine Books, with 12 to 24 pages of black and white photographs in the middle of the book. I remember many of them now. The Battle of Midway was the first book of war I ever read, and other titles I read included Martin Caden's A Torch to the Enemy about the bombing of Japan, and The Day Dresden Died about the Allied bombing of the German city of Dresden being wiped from existence in February 1945. A book called Zero about the Japanese fighter bomber that was the mainstay of the Imperial Japanese Air Force. And The First and the Last, a history of the German Air Force called the Luftwaffe by Adolf Galland. One book my dad had read a a few times, and of course I read it too, was one called The Desert Fox, about German Army General Erwin Rommel, a brilliant tank commander fighting the British, my dad, in fact, in North Africa. And Dad said he admired this German general, and at age 12 I find that confusing. Wasn't he trying to kill you, Dad, I asked? Yes, my dad said, but he fought alongside his men, he lived as they did, he ate as they did, and he suffered as they did, and he was brilliant in the field. My commanding officer, Field Marshal Alexander Montgomery, was an elitist snob who looked down on his men, and I never liked Montgomery, nor did any of my fellow Navy men. When I asked my dad why he joined the Navy and not the Army or Air Force, he said, well, I was a good swimmer, so if our ship was torpedoed by U-boats, which was the biggest danger at sea, especially in the North Atlantic or Mediterranean Sea, I'd have a good chance of surviving, I thought. In World War I, the infantry just got mowed down by enemy machine gun fire and slaughtered. The thought of dying like that terrified me. And the British Air Force was exclusively for the sons of the rich and the well-to-do, at least at the beginning of World War II, and I was from the poorest of the poor in a Birmingham slum, so the Air Force was not possible for someone like me. If you volunteered, you could choose which service to join, the Army or Navy, so at 16 I lied about my age, said I was 18, and the Battle of Britain was underway that month, so I joined and they willingly took me. They didn't look too closely at the age of any fit, able-bodied young man in those days. I had been working full-time at the Norton Motorcycle Factory since I was 13, so I was growing up already amongst men. I thought I would sign up at 16 if I could, so that I could choose the Navy over the Army. If I waited until I was drafted, I would have probably ended up in the Army. When I asked, well, how did you become a good swimmer, Dad, knowing he lived in the inner cities of Birmingham, England, he said, well, my brothers and I would swim in the canals. And I asked Dad, I said, well, what were the canals, Dad? And he looked at me and he sort of said, well, son, the canals were actually the sewers, really, but I never thought of it much about it at the time. I just knew that was the only place I could swim. And I remember looking at my dad with horror. I said, Dad, you swam in sewers for fun? And he looked at me and he'd say wistfully, well, I guess I did, son, and I became a very good swimmer, too. That's the only place there was to swim for a poor working man, son. Like many veterans of world wars, my dad spoke warmly of the camaraderie between his mates who depended on each other. He confided to me that his 5 years on destroyers and cruisers traveling at sea around the continent of Africa, stopping in ports like Durban, South Africa, and Mombasa, Kenya, and Alexandria, Egypt, and Benghazi and Tripoli, Libya, Malta, Tel Aviv, Palestine, and Cape Town, South Africa, were the best years of his life.